She never raised her voice. She didn't have to. By the time they realized how dangerous her silence was, it was already too late. Welcome back to Mr. Charles Stories, where dignity never begs for attention. If you've ever been underestimated for choosing peace over performance, like this video, share your thoughts in the comments and stay with us. This is the story of Sorelle Vaughan, the woman the world tried to ignore, until she stood beside power and no one could look away. Story begins. The bell above the shop door chimed softly every time someone entered. On most days, only a few did. The Vaughan bookshop on South Orange Avenue wasn't flashy. It didn't have modern shelves or glossy covers on display. Most of the books were second-hand. Some were out of print. All were meaningful. That was how her father ran things. People don't buy books for noise, he would say. They buy them for quiet answers. Sorelle Vaughan grew up believing that. She learned early that silence wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of intention. While other kids on the block practiced speeches in debate clubs, Sorelle sat at the back, taking notes. While her classmates raised their hands to be seen, she waited until she had something worth saying. And when she finally spoke, people listened, not because she was loud, because she'd already thought 10 steps ahead. Her father, Emery Vaughan, taught her to speak when it mattered and to walk away when it didn't. He was widowed young, raised Sorelle alone, ran the shop by day, read with her by night. She remembered being 9 years old, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the cash counter, reading the souls of black folk while he quietly restocked the shelves. He didn't praise her often. When he did, it sounded like, "You thought that through," or "You saw what others missed," or sometimes simply, "Good." That was enough. Sorelle never needed applause. She needed clarity, and she got it. By the time she reached high school, Sorelle was reading policy papers, not romance novels. She wrote essays that startled professors. She interned in local government offices at 17, listening more than she spoke, always watching how power moved in a room. At Rutgers, she finished her degree in public policy in 3 years, then earned a master in social infrastructure while working part-time at a women's equity non-profit. She was never the one standing on stages. She was the one writing the speeches the people on stage were reciting. At 24, Sorelle Vaughan became the youngest independent researcher to be invited to testify before the New Jersey State Committee on Urban Equity Reform. She wore a simple black suit. No jewelry, no makeup. She didn't tell personal stories. She showed numbers, cited root causes, offered policy-based solutions that didn't blame but corrected. And when a senator tried to interrupt her mid-point, she paused, blinked once, and said calmly, "I'll wait." And the room went still. What Sorelle didn't expect was how that testimony would ripple. Suddenly, news outlets requested interviews. Magazines asked for quotes. Podcasts wanted her voice. She declined most. "I'm not interested in fame," she told one host. "I'm interested in solutions." And that's when he noticed her. His name was Daxon Morell, CEO of one of the largest commercial real estate firms on the East Coast, Forbes 40 under 40. Widely photographed, perfectly tailored suits, fast-talking charisma, and a signature watch line worth more than some annual salaries. He'd been in the audience at the state committee testimony, quietly seated in the back, arms folded, eyes fixed. It wasn't her voice that drew him. It was the fact that she didn't try to impress anyone. He approached her 3 weeks later at a post-panel mixer. "I liked how you didn't explain your intelligence," he said. "Most people waste time doing that." She looked up from her glass of soda and said, "Most people are performing. I'm not." He laughed. "I noticed." Their conversation lasted 11 minutes. He asked for her number. She said she didn't give it out easily. He left her a card instead. Handwritten on the back, "Dinner, no press, no pressure. You pick the time." She didn't call. Not for 3 days. Then she texted, "Next Tuesday, 7 p.m, Nolita, quiet place." Dinner was, in fact, quiet. He didn't interrupt. She didn't overshare. They spoke about city design, zoning failures, tax loopholes, and what affordable housing should really mean. When he walked her to her car, he didn't try to kiss her. He said, "This is the first time I've had a conversation that didn't feel like a chess game." She smiled once. Maybe it still was. By their fourth date he was smitten. By the sixth, he said, "I'm going to marry you." Cyril blinked. "We haven't even disagreed yet." "That's the part I'm waiting for," he replied. She didn't laugh, but that was the moment she realized she liked him. Their courtship was fast, 6 months. The wedding was elegant and quiet. No press invites, just 40 people. Her father cried once during the father-daughter dance. She kissed his cheek and said, "You taught me how to pick calm." He whispered, "You chose well, baby." And she thought she had. But by their 1-year anniversary, she noticed something shift. Daxon stopped asking about her work. He started using phrases like, "You think too hard about things." "Babe, it's just dinner, not a dissertation. You're always quiet when people are around. That makes you look cold." At first, she dismissed it as stress. Then it became consistent. He bought her expensive jewelry she didn't need, stopped showing up at small policy events she invited him to, started going to more working retreats with only his assistant present. When she asked where he'd be, he'd kiss her forehead and say, "Still studying me, Professor Vaughan?" She said nothing, not because she was unsure, but because she already saw the pattern. And yet, she didn't react. She didn't confront. She observed. She remembered what her father taught her. When someone's trying to provoke you, your silence starves their performance. So she went silent. And Daxon started getting nervous. By month 14 of their marriage, Cyril Vaughan stopped asking questions Daxon never answered. She had learned that silence made some men louder, desperate to control the room they no longer understood. So she let him talk. "I think we need a vacation," he suggested one morning, while tightening his cufflinks in front of the mirror. "Just us. Somewhere quiet." "You like quiet." She glanced at him from her side of the bed. "You've had 3 in the past 5 months." He smirked. "I said us, not me." She didn't respond. Instead, she returned to her tablet, scanning housing reform data from the latest Newark pilot program she was helping restructure. The silence unnerved him. But he didn't say so. That evening, he didn't come home for dinner. No text, no voicemail, no apology. At 10:17 p.m., she received a notification from a social column blog, seen tonight, Billionaire. Developer Daxon Morell leaves Midtown Lounge with longtime assistant Crescent Vale. No statement, no denial. Just a photo. Her husband walking half a step ahead of his assistant. Crescent's hand on his elbow. The caption read, "Trusted aid or something more." Cyril didn't flinch. She closed the article. She opened her laptop. And she worked. Crescent Vale had joined Morell Holdings 2 years before Cyril entered the picture. Early 30s. Ambitious. Always nearby. The kind of assistant who managed everything except his conscience. There were whispers. Among staff. Among stylists. Even among social acquaintances. Cyril noticed things long before the internet did. New rings. Changed perfume. Sudden absences from scheduled team reviews. But again, she said nothing. Not because she was blind. Because she was calculating. Silence, after all, left no trail. But it did leave memory. And she had a long one. Weeks passed. The headlines cooled. Crescent remained in her husband's orbit, in meetings, on flights, at corporate events. But one morning, a quiet shift occurred. The board of trustees for the Global Equity Foundation contacted Cyril directly, not as Daxon's wife, not as an accessory, as a woman with her own resume. She'd been nominated as co-chair for a strategic committee on global urban equity reform, a position reserved only for people with real work. Quiet credibility, visible impact. She didn't rush to accept. She sent follow-up questions, asked for a breakdown of the strategic timelines, and requested a non-disclosure clause to be added for internal operations. They were stunned and impressed. They added her name to the press release the next morning. The announcement went live at 7 a.m. By 7:42 a.m., her name was trending. Cyril Vaughan to co-chair Global Equity Board. A new power rising? No interview, no tweet. Just results. Dignity is the new influence. A leaked photo from Brussels surfaced by noon. Cyril in a fitted grey suit, standing beside economists, global advocates, and UN liaisons. No smile, no makeup, just presence. Daxon saw the photo on his office screen. He stared at it for a long time, then muttered, "She didn't even tell me she applied." But Cyril hadn't applied. She was selected because of her work, because of her silence. He called. She didn't pick up. He texted. No reply. He sent flowers. They were returned. He left a handwritten note. It never reached her. Her assistant screened it and shredded it on arrival. By Friday, he tried again, this time in person. He arrived home with dinner. She was in her office, surrounded by 4 open folders and a call scheduled with an advisory team in Johannesburg. "You're busy," he said, standing at the doorway. She looked up briefly. "Always have been. I thought we could talk." She gestured toward the files. "I'm doing what you used to respect me for." His face tightened. "You're punishing me." She stood slowly. "If this feels like punishment to you, Daxon, maybe that says more about your view of silence than mine." He didn't answer, and that scared him more than any shouting ever could. Cressin noticed the shift too. Suddenly, her invitations were rescinded from certain events. Board members who used to smile politely no longer acknowledged her in elevators. A client bluntly said during a pitch, "This project needs transparency and cleaner hands." She tried to confront Cyril once, in the hallway of the Mirel Holdings building. "You've made things uncomfortable." Cyril turned to her. Calm, still, powerful. "I didn't say anything," Cressin snapped. "You didn't have to." Cyril's reply was cold and steady. "That's what makes it worse, isn't it?" And she walked away. Cressin's contract was reviewed 3 weeks later. A compliance audit exposed tampering in expense reports. Minor, but enough. She was terminated. Quietly. Without press. No press release. No job offers followed. And as she packed her things, she watched Cyril's name trend again. The woman who never clapped back, but still won. That night, Cyril walked into her father's bookstore, now run by a family friend, and looked at the shelves that raised her. She ran her fingers across a hardcover spine and whispered, "Thank you," because silence had never been weakness. It had always been preparation, and now she was ready. Have you ever stayed quiet, not because you were weak, but because you were focused? Have you watched someone underestimate your silence, only to realize later they were never listening? If Cyril's story is already speaking to something you've lived through, hit that like button, drop a comment, and share this video with someone who needs the reminder: silence isn't surrender. It's strategy. Subscribe to Mr. Charles Stories for the next chapter, where silence meets exposure, and the world begins to shift. The Mirel wedding wasn't held in a ballroom. It was held in a repurposed art gallery in Soho. Minimalist, elegant, 90 guests total. No drone footage, no bridal magazine exclusives. Just tall glass windows, live cello music, and white orchids suspended from iron beams. Cyril chose the venue. She chose the dress too, a tailored ivory sheath, with no train, no sequins, and no veil. When the press asked later why there were no official wedding photos released, she responded, "Because we didn't get married for proof, we got married for presents." But even she had to admit, looking back, that Daxon liked the idea of presents more than the practice of it. The marriage license was signed after the ceremony. His hands were smooth, confident, hers steady. Their prenup was quiet but clear. He insisted she didn't need to work. She insisted on a clause that protected her intellectual property. He agreed, with a smirk, "Still planning to outgrow me?" He teased. She didn't answer. She never answered when provoked. That was part of what made her so hard to read and so impossible to control. In the beginning, Daxon behaved like the perfect husband. He made breakfast, dropped in on her Zoom lectures, gifted her a private study lined with rare books, took her father out to baseball games every few weeks, even though he couldn't name 5 players. To the public, they were impeccable. He, the mogul in the 3000 blazer, she, the scholar with the quiet smile. To their inner circle, the story was slightly different. He's obsessed with her, someone once told a columnist off the record. But it's like he's trying to cage the sun, and even the most beautiful cages eventually rust. By month 3, he started correcting her in public. She didn't technically lead that research. She co-authored. Sorel's so humble, she forgets how young she is in the field. I joke she's the quiet storm, except when she gets too intense, and she'd just smile, because she already knew the difference between partnership and possession, and something inside her had started clocking the difference. Daxon often said he admired her strength. What he meant was that he liked her silence, as long as it didn't challenge his volume. At fundraisers, he placed her by his side like a living resume. At meetings, he asked her to translate policy terms for investors like she was a walking glossary. Sometimes he even introduced her as our resident brainiac. She never corrected him. She corrected his paperwork instead. Behind the scenes, Sorel saved him from legal missteps, zoning loopholes, and PR disasters. But her name was never on the documents, only her fingerprints. And he liked it that way. The first time she realized something had shifted was during a dinner at a rooftop event. A donor leaned in and said, "You must be so proud of what Daxon's done. Men like him need women like you. Quiet, solid, uncomplicated." She blinked once, then said, "And systems like these depend on women like me not responding to that." The table went quiet. Daxon laughed too quickly. "That's my Sorel. Always got a line in her pocket." She looked at him calmly. That one wasn't rehearsed. He squeezed her knee under the table. "Don't ruin the vibe, babe." That night, she started documenting things. Not in a legal sense, in a Sorel sense. She took notes on tone, on language shifts, on disappearing files. She began comparing schedules against press releases. She noted who was present when Cressin's name appeared where it shouldn't. And most of all, she listened, not for apologies, for patterns, because patterns never lie, even when people do. Her father visited that weekend. They sat on the bookstore floor after hours, eating grapes from a paper bag, surrounded by used books and old receipts. "Is he good to you?" he asked. She hesitated. "He's generous." Her father nodded slowly. "That's not what I asked." Sorel looked down at her hands. "He likes being seen beside me. He used to see me." Emery Vaughan sighed through his nose, then placed a book in her lap. It was their eyes were watching God. She flipped to the inside cover. He'd underlined one line in black pen. "There are years that ask questions and years that answer." She didn't cry, but her hands stayed on that page a long time. A few days later, she was invited to speak, not on behalf of Daxon's foundation, but for a closed-door strategy session on gender policy in city planning. She said yes. Daxon shrugged when she told him, "As long as it doesn't interfere with the gala next week. It's on a Wednesday morning." He nodded. "Then we're fine." That was it. No encouragement, no questions, no interest. And that's when she realized he no longer felt like her partner. He felt like her employer. One who wanted her brilliant, but not too visible. A month later, at that gala, she wore a charcoal gown. No slit, high neckline, low bun. He wore his usual designer tux and trademark grin. They posed for photos. The press labeled them power couple. No one saw how his fingers tightened slightly on her waist after she declined to toast him on stage. No one heard him whisper, "A little gratitude wouldn't kill you." She replied with one word, noted. At home, he poured a drink. "You embarrassed me tonight." "I protected my integrity," she said. "Do you think you're above all this now?" She met his eyes. "No. I think I was always outside of it." "You mistook my presence for belonging." He tossed back the drink, then tried to change the subject. She went to bed without a word. And that was the beginning of the real fracture. The following morning, Daxon was gone before sunrise. He left no note, no text, not even his usual headed-to-site review voice message. Cyril didn't wonder where he went. She already knew. Not the location, the pattern. When a man no longer respects your voice, he starts avoiding your silence. Because silence forces reflection. And Daxon wasn't built for reflection. By 10 a.m., she was in a conference room downtown with 4 women she admired. Architects, city planners, social economists. They were discussing ways to redesign urban transit for female safety. No photographers, no PR, just work. When Cyril spoke, she noticed something she hadn't felt in months. She was heard. Without being explained, the youngest on the committee leaned in and whispered afterward, "You're the first woman I've seen in power who doesn't raise her voice or lower her standards." Cyril smiled. That's not power, that's clarity. Meanwhile, Daxon was photographed at a luxury brunch in Montauk. Cressin Vale sat 3 seats to his left. In the photo, they weren't touching, but the lean between them told a fuller story. The article didn't accuse. It implied. That's how reputations bend before they break. That night, Cyril made dinner. She set 2 plates, sat down alone, ate slowly. At 9:26 p.m., the front door opened. He smelled like mint and cologne. New jacket, polished shoes. "Long day," he muttered, kissing the top of her head like a checkbox. She nodded. "Did you see the article?" He paused. "Which one?" She didn't answer. Just reached into her folder and slid a document across the table. It wasn't a threat. It was a policy brief, her latest submission to the Global Equity Committee. He glanced at it. "You're still going through with that?" "I already went through. This is the next phase." He said nothing. She kept eating. Cressin, on the other hand, was not quiet. She had begun referring to herself internally as integral. She briefed Daxon before meetings, spoke for him when reporters called, even corrected an investor once when he quoted Cyril's name instead of Daxon's. That was her framework, the investor said. Cressin cut in. "No, it was adapted by our legal team." It wasn't. But Daxon didn't correct her. And Cyril saw it all. At the next board event, Cyril entered alone. Daxon was delayed. Cressin arrived early. One of the foundation members whispered to Cyril as they took their seats, "We don't know how you tolerate her presence." Cyril said calmly, "She's not my consequence, she's his." Later that week, she prepared a keynote for a leadership summit in San Diego. She'd be speaking about dignity as infrastructure, how societies collapse when self-worth is systematically undermined. Daxon offered to fly with her. She declined. When he asked why, she said, "Because some stories are lighter when flown alone." On the flight, she reviewed her speech, then closed her laptop and stared out the window. In her heart, she wasn't broken. She was sorting, not pain. Truth. Back in New York, Daxon hosted a panel for rising real estate leaders. Cressin was there, seated beside him. One of the guests, a sharp young developer named Mallory, asked, "How do you balance leadership with personal accountability?" Daxon hesitated. "Well, leadership is accountability," Mallory smiled. "Then how do you show that outside of your team's success?" He shifted. "By letting the work speak for itself." Cressin jumped in. "Daxon's private life is irrelevant here." Mallory paused, then said bluntly, "Power without integrity always comes apart eventually." The room shifted, and for the first time, Daxon realized not all rooms respected his silence. Meanwhile, Cyril stood before 3,000 leaders in San Diego. She didn't open with stats, or a joke, or even an anecdote. She began with a sentence that quieted the auditorium. "Respect is confirmed by what you do when no one is clapping." The silence afterward wasn't empty. It was sacred. And when the applause finally came, it wasn't explosive. It was rising, from the back, forward, like recognition coming home. Cressin saw the speech on her phone the next morning. She was seated alone in a cafe. No calls, no replies, no invites. She clicked the headline, Cyril Vaughan, the woman who let silence speak. The comments underneath were brutal. She's what Cressin thought she was. Daxon fumbled global gold. This is what strength looks like without performance. And for the first time, Cressin realized something that shook her. She'd never been chosen. She'd just been convenient. And now, even that wasn't needed. When Daxon returned home, Cyril was reading. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment, then said, "They're saying I've been replaced." She didn't look up. "You were never in competition." He crossed the room, sat across from her. "I miss us." She turned the page. "You miss control." He asked, "Is it too late to fix it?" She finally looked at him. "Late is different from finished. You'll have to decide which one you're dealing with." The invitations started changing. First, the font. Cyril noticed it immediately. Cleaner, more modern, more brand conscious. Then the name order. No longer Mr. and Mrs. Mirel. Now it read, Daxon Mirel, CEO, Mirel Holdings +1. And Cyril, once listed beside him by name, now floated as a silent afterthought. If she hadn't been raised by Emery Vaughan, she might have questioned herself. Instead, she just read deeper. She saw the rotation of dinner guests, the media tags that skipped her, the foundation events where her seat was no longer at the central table, but one row behind. And Cressin Vale? She was front and center, every time. Not loudly, not dramatically, just present. Daxon tried to spin it as strategy. "She's better at media positioning," he said. "And you've been avoiding the spotlight anyway." Cyril tilted her head. "You mean I don't perform?" He smirked. "Same thing in this world." She didn't argue. She documented. It wasn't just her exclusion. It was the pattern of who replaced her. Cressin was on the list for Paris, for Hong Kong, for Aspen. On one trip, Cyril received a forwarded itinerary from a mutual acquaintance, a journalist she trusted. "Is this true?" The message asked. The attachment was labeled Mirel Holdings Strategic Expansion Retreat, Executive Team List. Page 2 listed 6 names, all men. And Cressin Vale, marked Deputy Operations. Cyril had never seen that title before. She replied with only 3 words, "It's being noted." At a charity benefit in Manhattan, things became unmistakable. Cyril entered alone, dressed in emerald satin, hair pulled into a low twist. She wasn't trying to be seen, but people still noticed. They always had. Daxon was already there. Cressin stood beside him. Black cocktail dress, soft laugh, hand grazing his arm as he spoke to donors. One reporter turned to Cyril and whispered, "I know we're not supposed to ask, but is this your quiet divorce phase?" Cyril looked at her without blinking. "This is the phase where silence builds what noise tries to hide." The reporter said nothing else. During dinner, Cressin took the mic for a short welcome. She said, "Tonight is about presence, about building things that matter, together." Cyril raised her glass and whispered under her breath, "Then you should have built your own." Someone across the table heard her. A prominent civic chair. He didn't smile. He nodded. She wasn't the only one watching. The next day, an anonymous blog posted a blind item. Real estate tycoon leans on longtime aide, while wife remains the class act in rooms they both once shared. No names. But everyone knew. The fallout began quietly. A board member resigned from one of Daxon's ventures, citing ethical misalignment. A contract renewal with a prominent European firm stalled after Cyril refused to endorse it. And a whisper campaign began to follow Cressin's appearances. Did she take that role or take her place? The line blurred, and reputations don't survive blur for long. Back at home, Cyril prepared for a speaking engagement in Geneva. Global Women in Governance. Daxon watched her pack. "Do you ever stop moving?" he asked. She zipped the bag calmly. "Do you ever stop watching?" He tried again. "This is getting ugly." She nodded. That's what happens when you decorate rot. In Geneva, she sat on a panel with two heads of state, one Nobel laureate and an activist who had been jailed for a decade before reforming national policy. She wasn't out of place. In fact, she anchored the panel. Her answers weren't dazzling. They were decisive. Her final quote was clipped by an international journalist and reshared over 200,000 times in 24 hours. Power doesn't decay because of opposition. It decays when those holding it refuse to tell the truth to themselves. Cressin watched the clip in her apartment, alone, with dinner cold on the table. For the first time, she said it out loud. She's not going away. Back in New York, Mirel Holdings lost a secondary investor. No reason given. But the grapevine buzzed. She was always the soul of his polish. Now he's just expensive noise. And Cyril? She never commented, never addressed the rumors, never clapped back. She worked. She led. She rose. And the silence spoke louder every day. Cyril sat in the back seat of a black sedan, headed to a closed-door strategy dinner hosted by the World Policy Forum. No cameras, no nameplates, just 12 voices selected for their influence, not their following. She was the only one under 40 in the room, and yet no one spoke over her. Not because she demanded attention, but because she used hers sparingly. Each comment she made had the weight of restraint behind it, the kind of weight that made even seasoned politicians pause before responding. She wasn't here to compete. She was here to recalibrate. At the same time, across the ocean, Daxon was at a rooftop launch party for a new real estate app. The crowd was younger, flashier. His suit was midnight navy. His date? Cressin Vale, now introduced as his executive partner, an investor from Dubai, asked, "Is this your wife?" Daxon froze. Before he could speak, Cressin answered for him. "No, I support his operations. She supports the headlines." He smiled, weakly, but something in the air shifted. The investor's wife, a powerful hotelier, turned away mid-toast. And just like that, perception began to curdle. Cyril returned to New York 2 days later. She'd picked up a copy of The Economist at the airport. Her name was mentioned on page 14 in an editorial about redefining silent leadership. The phrase that stuck, "She makes silence look like command." She folded the page, placed it in her folder, and carried on. Back at Mirel Holdings, things weren't so seamless. A compliance query emerged about an internal grant process. It had Cressin's name on the approval memo. Minor, but enough to trigger a secondary audit. Daxon tried to contain it. "She's loyal," he insisted to the legal team. One partner responded, "That's not what matters anymore. Public trust does." Cressin felt the cold long before it reached the headlines. Emails went unanswered. Meeting invites were postponed. A project she pitched was shelved indefinitely. And the worst part, Daxon didn't defend her. Not once. She confronted him one evening in his penthouse. "You said I mattered. That this we was going somewhere." He poured himself a drink. "You got the perks." She stepped forward. "I stood by you. You stood near me," he corrected. "That's not the same thing." And in that moment, she realized what Cyril had known all along. Some people only hold you close when they think no one better is watching. Meanwhile, Cyril was preparing to attend the Global Summit on Dignity and Development. She requested a small team to accompany her. 2 advisors, 1 researcher, and her new executive assistant, a young woman from Queens named Alina, who reminded her of who she'd been 10 years ago, focused, overlooked, precise. Alina asked, nervously, "Why me?" Cyril answered, "Because you're ready, even if they haven't noticed yet." But at the summit, Cyril didn't speak first. She waited, listened, took notes. When her turn came, she addressed the panel with one line. "I've seen power up close. It often mistakes visibility for virtue." The room leaned in. She followed with structured insight, clear, moral, sharp. No anecdotes, no drama, just substance. A global health official turned to the moderator and said, "She should be running this forum." And just like that, Another door opened, one she hadn't knocked on, one her silence had unlocked. Back in New York, things deteriorated quickly. The compliance review found inconsistencies in how Crescent had processed expenses. They weren't catastrophic, but they exposed a pattern of carelessness and favoritism. Daxon was advised to issue a quiet separation. No noise, no drama. He agreed. Crescent was informed by legal notice. No warning, no conversation. When she called him, he didn't answer. When she showed up at the office, his security detail blocked her. And when she emailed, all she got back was a standard closure letter. She left the building the same way she entered it 2 years ago, unnoticed. Cyril heard about the fallout days later from a reporter who asked for a quote. She declined. Instead, she forwarded the reporter a link to an upcoming panel she was leading on ethics and executive boundaries. No names, no sides, just direction. At home, Daxon tried again. He returned early, cooked dinner, lit candles, played soft jazz in the background, a mimicry of what used to feel real. Cyril walked in, removed her coat, sat. "You don't have to perform," she said. He exhaled. "I'm trying." She nodded once. Trying doesn't erase patterns. It reveals whether the apology is real or rehearsed. He looked down. "I miss being us." She responded softly. "You were never with me. You were beside me." But later that night, she stood by the window of her study, looking out at the city. Her phone buzzed. A message from Levan Cross, the strategist she'd met once in Geneva. "Watched your summit clip. Still thinking about your words on silent power. Dinner next month when I'm in New York?" She typed one word back, "Yes," then set the phone down and exhaled. Not because she was done, but because she was free. By morning, a new op-ed had dropped, The Quiet Rise of Cyril Vaughan, What Leadership Without Noise Looks Like. The final paragraph read, "In an age where outrage is often mistaken for strength, Cyril Vaughan reminds us that wisdom rarely needs to shout. It builds. And then, one day, it arrives, undeniable. And Crescent, she was never mentioned again. Because the world remembers the builders, not the ones who borrowed blueprints they didn't understand. The photo wasn't staged. It wasn't even official. It came from a diplomatic aide who snapped it during a break session at the Brussels Round Table. Cyril Vaughan stood between two world leaders, one from Denmark, the other from South Korea. No smile, no theatrics, just her signature calm, slate grey suit, folder in hand, chin slightly raised, listening, not posing. The image made its way to a journalist in the EU media circuit, then to Twitter, then to newsrooms across 3 continents. By the time Cyril landed in New York, she was trending in 12 countries. The caption that went viral was written by someone she'd never met. "This is what quiet power looks like. No noise, no drama, just earned space." Daxon saw the image while at a fundraiser. Someone handed him a phone. "Your wife's blowing up global media." Again, he looked at the screen. Froze. No jewelry, no husband, no caption beneath his name. Just her, standing tall, unattached. "She didn't tell me she was going," he muttered. The man beside him chuckled. "She doesn't need to anymore." At home, Cyril didn't mention the photo. She unpacked, ate a light dinner, reviewed new briefing notes for an upcoming city proposal. Her assistant forwarded her the coverage. She skimmed it and moved on. But the silence around her said everything. Her inbox pinged with invitation requests. Policy leaders asking for her insight. International programs asking her to guest lecture. And through it all, she gave no public response. Not even a repost. The press had questions. Was this her separation statement? Is this the soft launch of a new career? Is Cyril Vaughan preparing to run for office? She ignored them all, because Cyril never spoke to speculation. She spoke to purpose. Meanwhile, Daxon panicked. He called 3 times. The first went to voicemail. The second was intercepted by her assistant. The third came with a text. "Let's talk. I owe you that." She replied with 2 words. Not now. He sent flowers. They were returned. He mailed a handwritten note. It was shredded before she ever saw it. Her team knew how to filter for peace. He tried showing up to her speaking engagement at Columbia. Security turned him away. Cyril was no longer his +1. She was her own orbit, and that's what unnerved him most. In public, he tried to control the narrative. She's focused on her work. I support her fully. We've both grown. That's normal. No tension, just transitions. But in private, his grip slipped. Investors noticed his energy was scattered. One campaign dropped him as an endorser. His team quietly discussed reputation rebranding. All while Cyril said nothing. During an exclusive roundtable in D.C., a journalist asked her directly, "Do you have any comment about the rumors surrounding your husband's assistant and your professional shift?" She paused, took a sip of water, then replied, "I didn't need to convince anyone of my worth. I needed to keep working." And the silence that followed that sentence echoed louder than any scandal. That quote made national headlines. Cyril Vaughan breaks her silence, without saying a word about the scandal. Worth over words. She works. He wonders. Levin Cross saw the clip on his flight from Geneva. He smiled to himself and whispered, "She's not building a brand. She's restoring a standard." Back in New York, Cyril walked through the doors of a renovated education center in Harlem, one she'd funded anonymously years before. She greeted the staff, checked on the upgrades, and spoke with a group of teen girls who were studying urban planning models. One of them, barely 17, looked at her with wide eyes. "Is it true you didn't yell once through everything?" Cyril smiled gently. "It's not that I didn't want to. I just decided I'd rather spend my voice on building than burning." The girl nodded. "I want to learn how to do that too." Cyril placed a hand on her shoulder. "Start by choosing what deserves your energy. Most things don't." That night, her father called. He didn't mention the headlines, or Daxon, or the photograph. He simply said, "You okay?" She replied, "I'm clear." He chuckled. "That's better than okay." Elsewhere, Daxon attended an invite-only mixer with limited cameras. But someone still caught him in a corner, drink in hand, talking fast, Cressin beside him looking out of place. The image surfaced hours later. The caption, "He's still explaining. She's already working." Cressin noticed the mood shift too. People were cordial but distant. A few didn't look her in the eye. One of the wives of a major funder said flatly, "Loyalty isn't just a brand word, it's a filter," and then walked off. That night, Cressin asked Daxon, "Are you going to fix this?" He didn't answer. He just stared at his phone, at Cyril's face on another news segment. No scandal, no defense, no drama, just results. And all he could think was, he had her. And now the world knew what he lost. A week after the Brussels photo went viral, Cyril Vaughan's name was officially added to the leadership slate for the World Forum on Strategic Global Development. She hadn't applied, hadn't campaigned, hadn't even publicly confirmed her interest. They chose her because her work spoke louder than any self-nomination. She'd built her reputation the same way she built her arguments, slowly, precisely, and with no wasted energy. She was no longer the billionaire's wife. She was the one people rearranged tables for. Daxon, meanwhile, found himself shrinking in rooms where he used to expand. At a downtown investor brunch, the murmurs had shifted. "You think she's running for office? She's bigger than him now, isn't she? She's not even fighting. That's what makes this worse." Someone leaned in and asked him, "You proud of your wife?" He raised his glass. "Always," but the strain in his jaw told the truth. At home, Cyril moved differently now, not with pride, but with detachment. The hurt had stopped stinging. Now, it simply taught her what not to return to. They shared the same house, but not the same life. He came and went. She rose and moved forward. At night, her reading light stayed on long after he fell asleep. Sometimes she slept in her study, not out of anger, but out of clarity. She didn't need space. She had created her own piece. One night, while preparing slides for a digital roundtable, her assistant forwarded a notification. Mirel Holdings accused of inflated bidding practices in Midtown project. Cyril raised a brow. She knew nothing about the project. She wasn't asked, wasn't involved, wasn't copied. But her name, due to past association, was still being included in early reports. She drafted a single-sentence statement and posted it on her professional page. I have no affiliation with the Midtown initiative under review and have not contributed to its development. No drama, no defense. But her inbox filled up with quiet applause. In response, Daxon issued a public clarification. Cyril has her own independent work streams and is not associated with this project. It was the first time in years he'd publicly acknowledged her work as separate from his brand. But to many, it sounded like too little, too late. At a women's leadership panel, a moderator asked Cyril, "How did you stay calm through what many would have responded to with fire?" Cyril said simply, "Because fire consumes. I needed to build." Back at Mirel Holdings, tension brewed. 2 longtime advisors resigned. Whispers circulated about potential board restructuring. And rumors emerged that several firms were quietly pulling out of deals associated with Daxon's assistant's signature. He knew what that meant. The rot had reached the center, and he no longer had Cyril to buffer it. Cressin tried to fix it. She arranged interviews, prepped damage control, drafted talking points, but the press wasn't interested in hearing from her. They wanted to talk to the woman who wasn't talking, the one who kept rising. And so Cressin became invisible again. This time, not because she was excluded, because she was exhausted. She'd spent so long being a shadow that she forgot how to stand on her own. One night, while leaving the building, Cressin saw Cyril in the lobby. No cameras, no audience, just 2 women, one composed, one unraveling. Cressin walked up, unsure. Cyril met her eyes, expression unreadable. Cressin said quietly, "You win." Cyril replied, "I wasn't playing," and walked away. In a Midtown bookstore, one not far from where her father's used to. Cyril gave a private talk to a group of young policy students. She told them this: "If you spend your life responding to every insult, you'll run out of energy to build anything worth defending. Choose what you answer and who deserves your silence." The clip went viral. Again, and this time, the comments weren't just about her marriage. They were about her method. People weren't just watching her story. They were studying it. The following day, her assistant brought in a thick envelope. From the Office of National Strategy and Reform. They were inviting her to consult on the Women's Economic Development Bill, the most ambitious policy movement of the decade, a place only reserved for those with unimpeachable credibility. She read the offer, then looked up and said, "Draft my acceptance," quietly. That night, Daxon came home early. He sat across from her at the dinner table. No performance, no wine, no script. He looked tired, smaller, real. "I saw your name on the National Policy Board," he said. She nodded. He added, "They didn't mention me once." She met his gaze. "That's the first time you've admitted that bothers you." He swallowed hard. "I didn't know you'd rise like this." She didn't blink. "I always would have. You just assumed I wouldn't without your name next to mine." He asked her then, "Do you hate me?" She said gently, "No." I healed, then stood, collected her notes, and left the table, not as a punishment, as a boundary. He remained seated, still unsure when he lost her, not realizing it wasn't the headlines that ended them. It was the years he ignored her silence. And now? Now, the world had stopped ignoring her. Because while he tried to outshine, she simply outlasted. The Geneva Forum wasn't televised. No press, no photographers. It was invite only. Closed session. Attendance was limited to 15 thought leaders shaping post-conflict policy reform around the world. Cyril didn't walk in like a celebrity. She walked in like a solution. Her folder was organized, her answers measured. No anecdotes, no ambition leaks. She offered frameworks, not opinions. Clarity over charisma. And for the first time in months, she felt like her voice existed in a room that didn't require her to perform to be respected. Seated 3 rows behind her was Levon Cross, international strategist, Atlanta-born, Swiss-based, private to a fault. He wasn't moved by titles. He didn't clap because of trending names. He listened for patterns, observed behavior. And Sorrel? She had his attention long before she ever spoke. It was the way she turned slightly toward every speaker, never interrupting but always prepared to add value. It was the way she refused to recite talking points, but still carried the room with her logic. And when she finally spoke, outlining how small cities were scaling education access through neighborhood-led infrastructure, Levon didn't just hear brilliance. He heard alignment. After the session, there was a tea break, casual networking, small clusters forming. He approached without a drink in hand. No scripted opener, no introduction filled with titles. He simply stood beside her and said, "You made people think without trying to make them like you. That's rare." She glanced up. "You don't usually hear that as a compliment. That's because most people are rewarded for being liked, not being useful." She gave a small nod. "And you?" He smiled slightly. "I tend to remember the ones who aren't performing." They spoke for 24 minutes about design theory, global inequity, and the politics of silence. He never asked about her husband. She never offered context. When the forum reconvened, he said, "Maybe next time we're both in New York, you'd allow me to continue the conversation?" She replied, "Only if the conversation still deserves it." He grinned. "I'll earn that." Back in New York, Cyril resumed her routine. Meetings, strategy calls, quiet mentorship. Her phone buzzed one afternoon. Message from a Swiss number. Returning to NY next month. Would still love to earn that second conversation. She stared at it, then replied, "Let's see how the world behaves until then." He responded with a thumbs-up emoji. Nothing more. And that made her smile. Meanwhile, Daxon's world shifted beneath him. The viral images, the keynote clips, the silent praise Cyril received. He tried to match her, booked more events, launched 2 campaigns, hired a new image consultant. But it all came across as forced. One review called his recent speaking gig a man reaching for relevance, while the woman he once shared a stage with redefined it. Another commentator said flatly, "She's not moving quietly. We were just too noisy to hear her before." Cresson had been let go 3 weeks earlier. No press release, no comment, just an exit with no handshakes. The legal team managed it efficiently. Her access cards stopped working. Her name disappeared from internal documents. And just like that, she went from central to invisible. She tried to make contact, with Daxon, with PR, with mutual friends, but no one responded. It was as if the system that once used her had swallowed her whole once she lost value. She booked a flight, disappeared into Florida, no farewell. And Daxon? He sat in his penthouse one night, watching a clip of Sorrel from Geneva. The way she paused between points, the way leaders deferred to her. He whispered to himself, "I married that," then said aloud, "and I wasted it." Cyril received a small card in the mail. No return address. Inside, "You are being watched." And not by the ones who used to watch him. There was no signature, but she knew it was Levon. And for once, being watched didn't feel invasive. It felt like being seen. The second time they met was a cafe near the Met. Neutral ground. 2 p.m. on a Thursday. Levon wore no suit, no agenda. Cyril brought no files, no schedule. They sat for 90 minutes, talked about transition economies, education debt traps, and the difference between being chosen and being useful. At one point he asked gently, "Do you still believe people are worth trusting after all you've experienced?" She looked at him, thought for a moment, then said, "I believe people are worth respecting. Trust takes more than time. It takes consistency." He nodded. "And how do you define consistency?" She answered, "You don't disappear when it stops benefiting you." He smiled. Then I hope you'll let me keep showing up. They didn't kiss. There was no need. Because not all connections start with fireworks. Some begin with a shared silence that feels like home. When she returned home that evening, she found Daxon sitting in the living room. Lights dimmed, a glass of scotch in hand. He said, "You were with someone." She paused, removed her scarf. "I was with someone who asked better questions." He didn't reply. She walked past him, calm. And he knew this wasn't a threat. It was a beginning she didn't need to announce. Later that week, a major policy foundation asked Sorel to lead their annual summit. Their pitch was simple. You are no longer the footnote, you are the framework. She agreed, on one condition: no sponsors, no distractions, just solutions. They nodded, and then asked her to choose the opening keynote speaker. She sent them a name, Levan Cross. When they asked why, she said, "Because he's been listening longer than most have been talking." The summit hall held over 1,000 people, yet when Sorel stepped to the podium, the silence felt personal. No light shows, no dramatic music. Just her, a mic, and a blank stage. The moderator introduced her as a woman who made the world listen by choosing not to shout. She took a breath, then began. "I've been called composed, distant, strong, cold, brilliant, reserved. But rarely have I been asked what I choose to be." She paused. "I choose to be clear." That line landed like a weight. People didn't blink. They leaned in. "I choose to work instead of defend, to build instead of burn. And when I am silent, it is not because I have no answer. It is because the question is not worth my voice." Applause, not thunderous, but rising, like steady approval from people who understood. She nodded once. Continued. Backstage, Levan stood watching. No camera on him, no press hovering, but his posture was still. Hands folded, shoulders relaxed, eyes focused on her. Not the moment, not the reaction. Her. When she stepped off stage, he handed her a glass of water. "You didn't need to earn that room." She took it. "That's what makes it feel earned." They shared a smile, a silent understanding, and nothing more. That evening, she returned home to find a note slipped under her door. Daxon's handwriting. "You're becoming a story I no longer recognize. But I remember the beginning. I wish I had protected the middle." She folded the note, placed it in a drawer, didn't respond, because some messages are meant to be remembered, not replied to. In the following weeks, invitations poured in. Guest lectures, think tanks, journal editorials. But Sorel declined most of them. She wasn't interested in fame. She was interested in structure, real solutions, quiet wins. She formed a working group with mid-level policy leaders, many of them overlooked, women, and began mapping what she called legacy infrastructure initiatives. No logos, no names printed in gold, just real plans, measurable goals. It wasn't about taking space. It was about making it hold weight. Levan visited New York again. No press release, no high-end dinner. They met at a garden cafe in Brooklyn, under a tree. No tablecloth, no driver waiting. "You've been quieter," he noted. She sipped her tea. "Because I'm clearer," he smiled. "And clarity has no audience." "No," she said. "Clarity chooses its audience." They sat in silence for a moment. Then he asked, "Do you ever miss the noise?" She turned her head. "I miss being loved without being managed." His face didn't flinch. He said, "I don't want to manage you." She looked at him, calm. "Then keep showing up, and don't ask me to shrink." He nodded. "I wouldn't even try." They walked through the park afterward. No hand-holding, no posing. Just two people exchanging presence without pressure. At one point, a child ran past, chasing a kite. Sorel watched the string twist, then whispered, "Not everything that flies needs a stage." Levan glanced sideways. "And not everything that falls was ever grounded in the first place." She raised a brow. "You read poetry?" He shrugged. "I read silence." "Same thing." And she smiled. not wide, but full. Back home, Sorrel found Daxon in the study, a space that had once been hers. He stood, closed the file in his hand. "I didn't know you were back. I didn't announce it." He studied her for a moment. "You're different." "No," she said. "I'm consistent. You're just seeing me without your shadow." His mouth opened, closed. Then, "I miss who we used to be." She nodded. "I miss who you promised to be." He stepped forward. "Is there anything left?" She met his eyes. Steady, kind. "No. But there's no hatred either." He swallowed. "You loved me once. I still do, but differently. I love you the way I love old versions of myself, with respect, not return." And she walked past him. No slam, no rage, no storm, just clarity. Again, 2 weeks later, she and Levin hosted a quiet roundtable. No stage, just folding chairs and name cards. The topic, sustainable presence in power. One woman asked Sorrel, "How did you rebuild your credibility after being overshadowed?" Sorrel answered, "I didn't rebuild. I never lost it. I just stopped offering it to those who couldn't carry its weight." The room nodded, wrote it down. "And Levin?" He didn't speak much, but when she finished her final point, he said aloud, "Every empire that lasts is built in the years no one watches." Later, he walked her to her car. "You let me in slowly," he said. She replied, "Because I built slow. I won't let anyone crash through what took years to construct." He placed a hand over his heart. "Then I'll match your pace." And she believed him. Not because he said it, but because he'd already shown it. That night, Sorrel reread the Brussels article, the one that had started it all. She smiled once, then closed the tab. And for the first time in a long while, she slept with the windows open. No alarms, no second guessing, just air and peace. Have you ever met someone who didn't try to fix you? They just stayed? Have you ever walked away from noise and found clarity waiting in the quiet? If Sorrel's journey reminds you that true strength doesn't announce itself, it simply builds, tap the like button, share this story, and leave a comment below. Tell us, what moment in your life made you stop performing and start being real? And if you're ready for the next chapter, where consequences catch up and clarity makes its loudest impact, subscribe now. The quiet rise isn't over yet. Daxon had always been a master of control. He knew how to adjust narratives mid-interview, how to flip tension into strategy, how to pivot from headlines to headlines that made people forget the last ones. But this time, the noise didn't bend. It echoed. Investors were nervous, not because of a specific scandal, but because silence from Sorrel had made too much sense for too long. And Daxon's visibility had started to feel like compensation, not confidence. He didn't know how to adjust to that. The cracks showed first in small ways. A government contract that had been pending for months suddenly fell through. No explanation, just a quiet withdrawal. A board member at one of his ventures resigned without comment. The media interpreted it as a signal. Internally, team members stopped pushing Crescen's name forward, even though she was no longer with the company. No one said her name. They just deleted her contributions from decks and started distancing her name from policy initiatives. Daxon noticed. He called his legal advisor. "Should we issue a public clarification?" The reply was clear. "You don't need a statement. You need trust, and you don't have it." Meanwhile, Sorrel reviewed blueprints, not of buildings, of systems. She was designing a policy accelerator that supported mid-level city workers trying to create change from within. Her new initiative would partner with public universities, state advisory groups, and private donors who didn't want their names on billboards. She called it the Quiet Reform Fund. Someone asked her, "Why that name?" She replied, "Because the loudest revolutions don't always come with marches. Sometimes they sit at desks." In the middle of launching this initiative, she received an email from the Women's National Policy Journal. They wanted to feature her, not as the wife of, not as the woman who walked away, but as a builder. She agreed. During the interview, The editor asked, "What's the greatest cost of silence?" Cyril paused, then answered, "Being misunderstood by people who weren't listening in the first place." The quote became the cover line. Daxon saw the magazine. It was left on his desk by an intern. At first, he pushed it aside. Then he picked it up. He flipped through slowly, his name absent from every page. It wasn't a story about revenge. It wasn't even about loss. It was about legacy, and he wasn't part of it. That's when his hand trembled, not out of anger, but realization. He hadn't just lost Cyril. He'd lost what her presence made possible. At a partner's event, he tried to retell the old narrative. "We had differences in vision. Happens to every couple at this level," someone replied casually, except she never had to explain herself to remain relevant. The room went quiet. And for the first time, Daxon didn't have a comeback. Back at her office, Cyril received a message from Levan. "The building blocks are becoming visible. Quiet isn't invisible anymore." She replied, "That was never the goal. Only clarity." One afternoon, Daxon's head of operations knocked on his office door with a list. 6 projects. 4 flagged for review. 2 already stalled due to board inaction. "I don't understand," Daxon said. "These were airtight." The man hesitated. "They were when your reputation gave them lift." And then, slowly, carefully, without Cyril's shadow, people started looking at the details again. It wasn't meant to insult. It was a reality check. The next morning, a former investor published a blog post. It didn't name Daxon directly, but the subtitle was sharp. No matter how well a structure gleams, if the foundation was built on ego, it won't last. It trended for 3 days. Cyril's name appeared on a global speakers list. Slated for Berlin. Keynote. Daxon saw it in passing, on a Bloomberg ticker during a flight. He pulled out his phone, found the photo from their first anniversary. They were laughing. She had her hand on his chest. His eyes were on the camera. Her eyes were on him. He studied that detail for a long time, then shut his phone off and stared into the dark cabin for hours. At home, Cyril was reviewing applications for her Quiet Reform Fellowship. A name caught her attention. Someone from Newark, from a school she knew, a program she once funded anonymously. She invited the young woman for an interview. At the end of the call, the applicant asked, "Do you think silence is always the answer?" Cyril replied, "No, but it's always a strategy, and in the right hands, it becomes design." The girl whispered, "I want to learn that." "You already are," Cyril said. "You applied with no fanfare. That's a start." Later that evening, Cyril walked out onto her balcony with a cup of tea. The city buzzed below, not because of her, but it still moved, and that was enough. She didn't need to be the noise. She needed to keep building where others had forgotten how. And now, she wasn't building alone. Cressin hadn't returned to New York. She had slipped away quietly, assuming the storm would pass, that someone, perhaps Daxon, would call her back, offer her a new role, a better spin, a second chance. But silence followed her instead. Her last email went unopened. Her final voicemail was deleted, and no one corrected the record she once controlled. Because once a reputation crumbles, even whispers become evidence. In Manhattan, Daxon faced a boardroom packed with sharp suits and even sharper questions. They didn't yell. They didn't accuse. They simply asked, over and over, what went wrong? Why key deals lost steam? Why trust ratings dipped? Why press coverage became lukewarm after once being reverent? And behind every question was the one no one spoke aloud. What happens to a man when the woman who balanced him stops standing beside him? That same morning, Cyril walked into a classroom at the City Policy Institute. She wasn't there to speak. She was there to listen. A friend on faculty had invited her to sit in on a student-led design proposal for low-income neighborhood transit upgrades. She didn't wear heels or a blazer, just a soft wool sweater and clean notebook. At the end of the presentation, one student asked, "Did we miss anything?" Cyril smiled gently. You explained every step, but skipped the emotional cost. What does it feel like to depend on a system that forgets your name when it approves a budget? The room went quiet. Then the note-takers started scribbling fast. Across town, Daxon's newest proposal was rejected by the city advisory panel. It wasn't personal. It was procedural. His application lacked proper community engagement strategies. The irony was brutal. Sorel had built an entire method around that very model, but he never listened when she offered it freely. Now, it was being used to measure him, and he fell short. He left the meeting early. No press stop. No spin. He went home, sat in his study, and read through the last policy brief Sorel had left on the kitchen counter over a year ago. This time, he didn't skim it. He studied it. Sorel spent the evening finalizing her notes for Berlin. She would speak about systems of trust, how power structures fail when built on loyalty without transparency. Alina, her assistant, walked in with tea. "You're the last to confirm travel." Sorel nodded. "Because I don't need to rush presents." She looked up. "Did you book Levan's panel?" Alina smiled. "Front row slot. He said he'll speak only if you introduce him." Sorel grinned. "Then I guess I'll speak first." Levan had been consistent. No promises, no pressure, just presence. He called when he said he would, showed up when he wasn't expected, spoke only when he had value to add. She once told him, "You don't interrupt." He'd replied, "I don't need to." It was the first time she realized how much she'd gotten used to being managed instead of witnessed. Back at Morel Holdings, Daxon's executive team called a retreat, not for planning, for reflection. 3 partnerships were hanging by threads. One was already gone. A new strategist was hired to clean up the brand, but every pitch came back to the same problem. There's no story people want to believe in anymore. That was the phrase that gutted him, because once she was that story, and he had made her invisible. That night, Daxon stood on his balcony, the same one where he once took calls, while Sorel sat inside, quietly mapping frameworks that no one thanked her for. Now, it was her name in journals, her voice in summits, her system in city models, his, an echo. He pulled out his phone, typed a message, then erased it, typed again, then sent, "They still ask about you, not us." "You." No reply. He stared at the screen for 15 minutes before putting it face down. Sorel saw the message. She didn't ignore it out of cruelty. She paused because she understood its purpose. It wasn't a question. It was a confession. She placed the phone down, finished her tea, then drafted her Berlin opening. You cannot unknow how you were treated once your silence made someone uncomfortable. And you cannot return to the rooms that asked you to be less so they could feel more. 3 days before the Berlin flight, she met Levin for dinner. No candles, no performance, just real plates, real food, real time. He said, "You haven't told me how it ends." She replied, "Because it doesn't. Stories like mine aren't about endings. They're about redefinitions." He nodded. "And your new definition?" She thought for a moment, then said, "Voice that doesn't chase microphones, presence that doesn't apologize, love that doesn't need to be louder than peace." Levin raised his glass. "To the quiet ones who never stopped building," and Sorel clinked it gently. "To the ones who learned how to stay." The plane touched down in Berlin under a soft grey sky. No cameras waited at the terminal. No applause greeted Sorel as she stepped onto the tarmac. But everyone in the Forum Center knew she had arrived. A quiet shuttle drove her to the conference venue. No escort, no entourage. Just her and a binder filled with timelines, case notes, and handwritten margin questions she still hadn't resolved. Outside the hotel, Levan was already waiting. Not because he needed to be seen, but because he'd promised, "I'll be where the work matters." And he was. He opened the car door for her. Didn't rush a greeting. "Welcome," he said simply. She smiled. "I've already been welcomed, just not out loud." The Berlin conference was unlike any other. No red carpets, no VIP lounges, Just rooms filled with people serious about rebuilding justice systems in places where silence had long been mistaken for peace. Serral's opening address was slotted between a Nobel Peace nominee and a woman who'd survived a corrupt war tribunal. She didn't try to outshine either. Instead, she offered a framework, 5 conditions for sustainable change. 1. Presence without applause. 2. Truth that doesn't require anger. 3. Boundaries held without force. 4. Silence that questions systems. 5. Love for the unseen impact. It wasn't a speech. It was a blueprint. And when she finished, the room stayed quiet for 10 full seconds. Then came the longest standing ovation of the day. Backstage, Levan waited. She sat beside him, took a breath. Did I go too theoretical? He shook his head. You made them remember what's possible when you don't rush to be heard. She leaned back. It feels different. What does? Being respected without being chased. That night, they shared a small dinner in a quiet restaurant away from the conference buzz. They didn't talk about policy. They talked about real things, where they were when they first learned disappointment, what silence meant in their homes growing up, who taught them to listen without waiting to speak. Levan said, "My father only spoke in full thoughts. If he didn't have one, he waited." Serral smiled. That sounds familiar. Levan asked her, "What about love?" She paused. "I thought it was something you protected by making yourself smaller. And now I know love should never make you less visible to yourself." He nodded. "Then I see you. Clearly." And she believed him. Back in New York, Daxon sat in the back seat of a luxury SUV outside the launch of a new waterfront project. Dozens of cameras. Speeches. Flashy architecture. But his name wasn't on the headline. He was listed as a minor partner, a silent investor. His assistant asked, "Do you want to go inside now?" He looked out the window and replied, "They don't need me anymore." And for the first time, it wasn't just a feeling. It was a fact. Serral's Berlin sessions were republished by academic journals across 5 countries, translated into 3 languages, cited by senior advisors in state departments she once couldn't get a meeting with. She didn't brag. She simply filed her notes and responded to the next request with her usual, "What's the impact goal?" Levan flew back to Zurich, but before leaving, he handed her a small card. No pressure, no demand, just a note. "When you're ready to build something beyond policy, I'll be right here." She folded it, placed it in her passport. A week later, Serral returned to Newark. Not to speak, not to perform. She walked into the small bookstore her father once owned, now restored, reopened and renamed Vaughan and Daughters. The manager smiled. "We kept the layout, mostly." Serral walked the aisles slowly. Her fingers brushed spines of books that once held her together during silent years. At the counter, a young girl whispered, "Are you her?" Serral replied gently, "That depends on who she is. You're the one who never yelled but still got everything to change." Serral chuckled softly. "No, I'm the one who remembered change doesn't come from volume, it comes from vision." Later, she sat alone in the back reading corner, her favorite spot from childhood. No spotlight, just a chair, a worn book, and a window facing a city that once forgot her name. She opened a fresh page and wrote 3 words in the margin, "Safety feels different." The following day, Serral received an invitation. It wasn't from a media outlet or a global summit. It came from a small civic leadership program in Harlem. The email read, "Would you be willing to speak to 20 young women about staying, grounded when the world either forgets you or wants to own you?" There was no PR team attached, no honorarium, just a room with folding chairs and big hearts. Serral replied, "Yes. Let's keep it off record." And that's how, 3 days later, she found herself sitting on a wooden stool, in a recreation center, without slides, without a microphone, just stories. She shared how she learned to write policy from the margins, how being underestimated made her sharper, how love, when real, never demands that you go silent to keep peace. A girl with long braids raised her hand, unsure. How do you know if you're healing or just hiding? Cyril smiled softly. You stop hiding when your boundaries no longer feel like punishment. You start healing when your silence no longer feels like escape, but like protection. The room stayed still. Then, quiet nods. And for the rest of the evening, Cyril didn't teach. She listened. And that, the listening, was what moved them most. Afterward, one of the facilitators walked her out. That forehead kiss you gave that girl? Cyril blinked. Her story broke my heart. That kiss was all I could give. She hasn't spoken to anyone in 6 months, the woman whispered. That kiss will last longer than your speech. Meanwhile, Levan sent her a message. I'm near Boston next week. If you'd like a quiet space to think, I know a place. She replied, Tell me more. It turned out to be a small cabin near a lake in a town with no real traffic, no luxury, no schedule. She took the train, no security, no announcement. Levan met her at the station in a sweatshirt, holding 2 coffees. They didn't hug, they didn't make it formal, just eye contact that said, You chose to come. I see that. The cabin had 1 large reading chair, 1 fireplace, a long kitchen counter, and silence that didn't press on her. She exhaled, and for the first time in years, her shoulders dropped without instruction. That night, they made dinner together. Nothing elaborate. Pasta, a salad, a shared rhythm. He set the table. She poured the drinks. He didn't ask for a conversation. She gave him one anyway. I used to be afraid of peace, she said. It meant I had to hear myself think. And now I want silence more than applause. He didn't respond. He simply reached across the table and touched her wrist. Not possession, just presence. After dinner, they sat in the reading chair, her legs tucked under her, his arm lightly around her shoulder. The fire crackled. No tension, no expectations. And when she closed her eyes briefly, he kissed her forehead once. Not to start anything, but to thank her for being real. She didn't say anything, but her hand found his. That was enough. The next morning, she stepped outside to watch the water. No phone, no headlines, just fog lifting from the lake like a promise of clarity. Levan joined her, handed her a cup of tea, asked, Did you sleep? She nodded. First night, I didn't dream of being chased. He looked at her. By what? Expectations, roles, versions of myself. I was tired of feeding. He didn't offer advice. He just said, Welcome to stillness. Back in New York, Daxon finalized the sale of one of his holdings. The buyer didn't mention Cyril, didn't ask for his personal brand value. The negotiations were clean and distant. He called his lawyer afterward. They didn't ask a single question about my leadership reputation. The lawyer replied, That was the point. It didn't add value. Daxon ended the call, sat in the same penthouse that once felt like the top of the world, and realized it had become a box with mirrors. That evening, Cyril received a voicemail. Daxon's voice, soft, hesitant. I used to think you were too quiet for your own good. I know now you were quiet for mine. I know I'm not owed your voice anymore. But if you ever choose to speak to me again, I'll listen. No expectations. She didn't delete the message, but she didn't return the call either, because some apologies are best heard, not reopened. Before returning to the city, Levan drove her into town. They sat in the car before the train arrived. He said, I'm not in a rush, but I'm not unclear. She looked at him. I know. He leaned in, not for a kiss, but for another forehead press. She leaned forward slightly. That's your thing, isn't it? No, he said. That's yours. I just get to witness it. She boarded the train and waved once through the window. Not goodbye, just recognition. That night, in her apartment, Cyril lit a candle. No wine, no television. She picked up a notepad and wrote, Some people lose you quietly, not with slams or shouts, but with a realization that you're already elsewhere, being honored. She tore the page, folded it, placed it in her desk, then turned off the light and let the piece stay. The Global Summit on Women's Strategic Leadership had 3 floors, 18 countries represented, and 0 tolerance for empty symbolism. No flashy branding, no celebrity panels, just work. Cyril arrived with a slim folder and no assistant. Alina stayed back in New York, per Cyril's request. "I need to walk in alone," she'd said. And she did. Delegates recognized her instantly, but no one rushed for selfies. Instead, they moved aside, not out of fear, but recognition. Because when someone's earned respect, their silence clears a path louder than footsteps. Her panel began at noon. Topic: Sustainable Power Beyond Popularity. The room filled. Quietly, intentionally. When the moderator introduced Cyril, she kept it simple. "Today, we're honored to hear from a woman whose voice has shifted conversations without raising her volume." Cyril stepped forward. She looked around the room, not for applause, but for attention. And then she began. "Respect is not built in spotlights. It's confirmed in what we do when no one's clapping." Silence, then nods. She continued. "I've watched leaders beg for platforms they weren't prepared to honor. I've watched institutions promote faces before understanding the work. And I've lived through being positioned before being respected." Her words didn't pierce. They landed. Steady, deep, measured. No one owes you reverence, but you owe yourself a standard. Keep it even when the rooms grow quiet. Levan stood at the back, arms crossed, head slightly tilted. He wasn't there to take up space. He was there to witness her in hers. When she stepped down from the stage, the room didn't erupt. It stood, without clapping, just rising. Some gestures don't need noise. After the panel, a policy director from Stockholm asked Cyril over tea, "How do you manage staying present without becoming performative?" Cyril stirred her cup slowly. "I remove the need to be understood by everyone. Then I focus on the few who are listening with intent. And how do you know who they are? They show up quietly. Over time." She didn't look at Levan, but the question hung there. Later that evening, Cyril returned to her hotel room, removed her heels, unclipped her name tag. She sat by the window, watched the city slow down. Her phone buzzed. "Levan, you were still the calmest person in the loudest room." She replied, "Because I wasn't trying to survive in it, just offer something it could carry." Meanwhile, back in New York, Daxon was navigating his own storm. A prominent publication released an investigative piece about financial irregularities in 2 of his previous development projects. While nothing criminal was confirmed, the article raised questions, and questions create shadows. 1 investor pulled out. 2 scheduled interviews were cancelled. A summit rescinded his panel slot without notice. He made calls, left voicemails. No one answered. For years, Cyril had buffered his brand with her credibility. Now, his calls met the silence he once mocked. He stared at the framed photo on his desk, one from their early marriage. Cyril was looking away from the camera, mid-sentence. He'd loved that about her then. How she thought before speaking, how she never chased the moment. Now, that same trait haunted him, because her silence felt earned, his felt empty. Across the ocean, Cyril attended a private session for delegates working on cross-border equity reform. Each person was asked to share one turning point, personal or professional, that shaped how they defined leadership. When it was her turn, she spoke without flinching. "Mine wasn't a moment. It was a pattern. I kept being invited into rooms where I was expected to validate someone else's presence, not offer my own." A woman across the table teared up. Another whispered, "I know exactly what that feels like." Cyril nodded and passed the mic. That night, Levan walked her back to her suite. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. But as she paused at the door, he said, "There's something about the way you move through power that resets how people enter a room." She looked at him, tired but soft. "And what if I'm still learning that? Then don't rush. I'm not here to test your pace. I'm just here. Then, quietly, gently, he touched her face and kissed her forehead. No heat, just warmth, and she leaned into it. Not because she was unsure, but because she was ready. The morning after the summit, Berlin's skyline was soft with fog. It diffused the city lights and made everything feel like it was moving slower than usual. But Cyril wasn't in a hurry. She'd been in fast rooms for too long. She wrapped her robe tighter and stepped onto the small balcony attached to her suite. Below, traffic murmured. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang. It was a rare kind of quiet. Earned, not given. She picked up her phone. No headlines about her. No posts twisting her message. Just a quiet buzz of emails from women who'd attended the panel. One simply said, "I've never seen someone hold silence that loud." She closed her eyes. It wasn't validation she craved. It was confirmation that she hadn't wasted her pain. That same morning in Manhattan, Alina poured herself a coffee and scanned her inbox. Her name had been mentioned in the article exposing Daxon's mishandlings. A footnote, but still visible. She'd convinced herself that proximity to power would offer protection. It hadn't. One sponsor sent her a courtesy message, "We'll be postponing your pitch session until further notice." Another partner's assistant cancelled a networking brunch. No explanation, just sudden distance. Later that afternoon, a journalist reached out to Alina privately. She'd previously ignored his attempts to ask about the project budgets she managed. But now he had names, numbers, receipts. "Would you like to comment before the full report drops?" She said nothing. But her silence didn't buy her time anymore. She paced her apartment. The same one Cyril helped her secure when she first moved to the city. The lease was in both their names. She hadn't told Cyril she never took her name off. Suddenly, the place felt small. Not just in space, but in dignity. She opened her laptop and drafted a message. To Cyril. She didn't send it. Because some redemptions need more than apologies. They need consequences. In Berlin, Cyril met Levan for dinner. It wasn't fancy. Just a corner table at a quiet restaurant with handmade menus and real candles. He poured water into her glass before filling his own. "Can I ask something?" "You always can. Do you miss him?" She didn't flinch. "I miss what I hoped he would be. I don't miss who he was." That's a hard line to draw. It's not a line. It's a boundary. He leaned back, his fingers toying with the linen napkin. "And do you think there's ever real closure?" Cyril took a sip. "I think closure is sometimes just choosing not to carry what was never ours to hold." That night, Levin walked her back again. No words, just steps. And before she entered her suite, she turned to him and asked quietly, "Do you know what peace feels like?" He didn't answer with a definition. He stepped closer, brushed her curls gently away from her cheek and said, "Maybe it feels like this." Then he kissed her. Slow, present, honest, and when they pulled apart, she didn't rush back inside. She stood there a moment longer, letting herself be held by something safe. 3 days later, Cyril returned to New York. Not for Daxon, for herself. She hadn't planned on reaching out, but when she checked her old P.O. box there was a letter, handwritten, no return address. It was from his mother. Inside, one sentence stood out. "I don't know what he thought he lost, but I know what we all lost when you stopped showing up." She tucked it back into the envelope. Sometimes, silence travels farther than words ever could. She stopped by Reisel's main office. The team didn't know she was coming. The young receptionist blinked twice. "Ms. Van?" Cyril smiled softly. "Just Cyril today." Inside the workspace, a junior strategist was leading a session on ethical brand growth. She didn't stop when Cyril entered, and Cyril didn't expect her to. That's how she knew the legacy was real. It didn't need her name in every room. It needed her values in every decision. Elsewhere, Daxon was in damage control. But no amount of spin changed the silence that followed him. Investors who once crowded him at galas avoided him at elevators. The assistant who used to hang on his every word now clocked out without a backward glance. He tried to contact Cyril. 2 emails, no replies. 1 voice message. Whatever you think of me now, just know, I didn't know how to be enough for your silence. It scared me, and I filled it with noise. She didn't respond, because the apology wasn't meant for her healing. It was meant for his relief. And she wouldn't offer that anymore. At a private gala hosted by a non-profit partner, Cyril was invited to speak on resilience in legacy work. She arrived in a simple silk dress and no entourage. When her name was called, the room leaned in. She opened with, "Power means nothing if it can't survive outside applause. What you build only matters when it holds without you." Halfway through, she paused, looked directly at the young professionals in the back. The world watched my silence. But here's the truth. Silence is not absence, it's presence, measured. Somewhere in the room, someone exhaled like they'd been holding their breath for years. Alina saw a clip of that speech. She didn't share it, didn't repost. She simply turned off her screen and then called the ethics committee at her firm to tell the truth, not for credit, not for redemption, but because shame cannot be the last word in a story she helped write. She knew the consequences would come, and they did. She lost her partnership track, but gained something else. She walked into her mother's home in the Bronx and said, "I'm not proud of what I did, but I'm proud I didn't let it keep happening," and her mother didn't scold her. She nodded. Sometimes the hardest path back is the honest one. Back at Cyril's brownstone, Levan helped carry groceries inside. He placed them on the counter, looked around and said, "It smells like cinnamon and clarity in here." She laughed. And then she kissed him, because the world could watch whatever it wanted. But this was hers. The morning light in New York was different. It didn't ask for attention. It assumed it. Wide, firm, and unapologetic, it poured through the kitchen window of Cyril's brownstone as she stirred. A small pot of oatmeal, barefoot, hair tied up in a wrap, a playlist humming quietly from her phone. She wasn't rushing anywhere. That felt new. For over a decade, mornings had been about catching up. Emails, flights, press briefings, cleaning up other people's decisions, and apologizing for delays she hadn't caused. Now, the silence was hers. Not an absence, but a shift, a clarity. Behind her, Levan walked in, shirt still wrinkled from sleep. He placed his palm against her back without saying a word, then leaned in and kissed her shoulder. The quiet between them was not awkward. It was warm. A language. "You didn't sleep much," she said without turning. "Didn't want to miss this part," he murmured. She handed him a mug. "Then you get to stir while I take a shower." He took the spoon from her, smiling. "Deal." As Cyril stepped into the steam of the bathroom, she caught her reflection. Not flawless, not filtered, but deeply hers. And she whispered, almost without meaning to, "Thank you." It wasn't about Levan. It was about space, about finally making room. That same morning, across town, Daxon's legal team met without him. Not out of disrespect, but efficiency. His name, once shorthand for decisive leadership, had become a risk factor. They were no longer managing a brand. They were managing fallout. Investor withdrawals had doubled in the last week. 3 partners were filing for financial misrepresentation, and a federal investigation into offshore accounts had quietly opened. None of this surprised Cyril. What did surprise her was a call. Not from him, from his sister. "Can we talk?" the voice asked, over voicemail. I think I owe you clarity." Cyril didn't respond right away. Because forgiveness, in her world, was not a performance. And clarity didn't need an audience. She waited 2 days, then sent one sentence, "If you're ready for truth, I'll meet you." One time, no second chances. They met at a small cafe in the Lower East Side. No photographers, no security, just 2 women, both aged by what they'd seen, though only one had chosen to grow from it. "Thank you for agreeing," the sister said. "I didn't do this for you," Cyril replied. She stirred her tea, waiting. The woman, Adra, sighed. I knew about the assistant, about how he used your name to raise funds. I knew and I said nothing. I told myself I was protecting the family, but really, I was protecting my comfort. Cyril didn't flinch. She'd expected deflection. What she got was a rare kind of discomfort, truth in raw form. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Adra continued. I wanted you to know I saw it. And I was wrong. Cyril nodded once. Then we're clear. Adra's shoulders slumped, as though she'd been holding breath for years. They didn't hug. There was no need. Closure wasn't always reconciliation. Sometimes it was just acknowledgement. That evening, Cyril stopped by the local school where Rizel had launched a new mentorship program. She didn't wear a name tag, didn't introduce herself as the founder. She sat in the back, watching two teen girls lead a discussion on self-worth. One girl, barely 17, stood and said, "My sister told me that silence is a weakness, but now I know. Silence is where I decide what gets to grow." Cyril felt her throat tighten. The legacy was moving, and it didn't need her to narrate it. At Alina's office, consequences had settled like dust. Her badge still worked, but her desk had been cleared. The ethics committee placed her on an indefinite suspension. No severance, no press statements. She packed up what little was hers. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't craft a strategy. She went home, to the Bronx. Her mother opened the door and simply said, "Finally." Alina sat down at the kitchen table and cried. Not for pity, for release. I was scared to tell the truth. Her mother poured tea, slid it across the table, and said, "Scared doesn't disqualify, right? It just means it cost more." Alina nodded, wiping her face. "I don't expect anyone to forget." "They won't," her mother replied, "but they might notice if you don't repeat it." The truth didn't erase what Elena had done, but it made space for who she might still become. Meanwhile, Daxon stared at an old photograph. It was framed, oddly, in his guest bathroom. One of the few places Cyril had never stepped into, calling it wasted space. The photo was from their early years. A conference in Geneva. She'd been speaking to a group of young women. He'd been watching from the side, eyes full of awe. That version of him felt so far away. He didn't know how to return to it. And maybe that was the point. Some men don't get redemption arcs, because they confuse access with ownership, silence with surrender, love with utility. That weekend, Cyril and Levin took a walk along the West Side waterfront. No agenda, just time. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small folded paper. "What's this?" "An idea," he said. She unfolded it. A proposal for a new community space, led by women, funded ethically, tied to no legacy but its own. "I've been thinking," he said. "You've held so much for others. Maybe it's time you build something that doesn't require your past to justify it." She looked at him. Not with awe, but with peace. "You're not scared I'll outgrow you?" He smiled. "I hope you do. And I hope I'm standing close enough to clap." She took his hand. "Because some men don't fear your light. They walk you toward it." And in that moment, with wind in her curls and warmth in her chest, Cyril Van didn't feel like a woman who'd lost everything. She felt like a woman who'd chosen what to carry forward. And that made all the difference. Cyril stood in front of the mirror, pinning her curls up one coil at a time. Her reflection didn't ask for permission, it held space. The scar near her left collarbone from a college cycling accident, the softening under her eyes that came after sleepless months, the slight crease from raising a brow too many times in boardrooms where her voice had been overlooked. None of it made her lesser. All of it made her real. Behind her, Levan stood in the doorway, arms crossed, a quiet smile playing on his lips. He was already dressed, collar open, shoes still in his hand. "You keep looking at me like that," she said without turning, "and we'll be late." "I already texted them we'd be 30 minutes behind," he replied. Didn't say why. She arched a brow in the mirror. "And what makes you think they won't guess?" He stepped in, pressing a soft kiss to her bare shoulder. "Let them. You've earned softness." It had been nearly 2 months since the media fallout. Daxon's empire hadn't collapsed overnight, but it had buckled. The foundation of silence and performance couldn't hold under weight. Investors didn't walk away because of bad press. They walked because Sorrel stopped defending him. Her absence, quiet, measured, intentional, was the loudest move of all. At the Rizal Foundation's new expansion event, the venue buzzed with energy. Not photographers, not press releases, just women, mothers, young professionals, returning citizens, mentors, and mentees, gathered in shared space. No one wore suits to impress donors. No one stood on stage to pretend power. They sat in circles, spoke with intention, laughed without watching their backs. Cyril arrived without a grand entrance. She sat next to a woman in a hijab, shared notes with a teacher from Queens, and listened to a 15-year-old girl explain why she wanted to become a financial analyst. Not for wealth, for knowledge. "You should be on the board," Cyril said after listening. The teen blinked. "Me. You already are," she said, sliding a blank name badge across the table. Real leadership wasn't handed down. It was handed over. That night, Levan made dinner. No apron, no candles, just jazz playing in the background, and 2 plates of pan-seared salmon. "You know," Cyril said between bites, "the last time someone cooked for me, he lied through the whole thing." Levan didn't flinch. He simply asked, what did he lie about? Being honest. They both paused. Then Cyril said, "I don't want to keep naming him. I want a future that doesn't orbit around what broke." Levan raised his glass. "To what's being built." She clinked hers gently. With both hands, they finished dinner, washed dishes together, sat on the couch in socks. And when she leaned against him, head resting on his chest, feet tucked under her, it wasn't because she needed saving. It was because home had started to feel like someone again. Across the city, Alina sat at a long conference table, not in a law firm, not in a tower, but in a public community building where a restorative justice circle was being held. Her name had appeared on dozens of headlines, not as a whistleblower, but as a willing accessory to unethical behavior. She didn't deny it. Instead, she attended each circle as required, spoke only when called upon, listened, apologized, showed up the next week, and the next. Trust wasn't earned through speeches. It was rebuilt through presence. During one session, an older woman asked, "Why didn't you speak up when you saw the lies?" Alina replied, "Because I thought loyalty meant silence." The woman nodded slowly. "What do you think now?" "Loyalty without clarity becomes complicity," Alina said. "And I let it." That evening, she didn't reward herself, didn't post about her journey, didn't caption it as growth. She just went home and journaled 5 things she'd done differently that week, and planned to repeat them. Daxon sat alone in a hotel suite, the kind booked for business trips that no longer came. He had filed appeals, hired PR experts, fired half of them, and released. A half-hearted apology that went viral for all the wrong reasons, but none of that mattered now. The board had removed his voting rights. 3 of his previous assistants filed official statements, and an anonymous source had leaked the real estate shell structures he used to funnel funds, structures Cyril had flagged quietly months before. His downfall wasn't dramatic. It was precise, ethical, and eerily calm. The same calm Cyril had mastered all those years beside him. He picked up his phone. No messages, no texts from people who once clung to his proximity, only one missed call from an unknown number. And a voicemail, Cyril's voice. Short, clear. "I don't hate you, but I'm no longer the version of me who tolerated you." Click. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply sat back and stared at the ceiling. Because sometimes silence is not emptiness. It's verdict. Later that week, Cyril met with Levan's sister, a pediatrician in Brooklyn who had been skeptical at first. "Let me guess," she said, eyeing Cyril as they sipped iced tea. "You're the one who made my brother stop running." Cyril smiled softly. "I didn't chase him." "Good," the woman said. "Because he only stops when something's worth stillness." They talked for hours. Not about Levan, about Books about community healthcare, about school zoning in black neighborhoods, about healing as a verb, not a destination. By the time Levan arrived to pick Cyril up, his sister was already planning a Rise L health initiative with her. He grinned. "Should I be worried?" Cyril laughed. "You're already outnumbered." The final chapter of this phase didn't come with a wedding, or an island trip, or fireworks. It came with Cyril standing in her old apartment one last time. Everything had been moved. Only a single envelope remained on the counter, her name handwritten on it. Inside, a check from a private buyer. Full asking price. No counter. She closed her eyes, smiled, and whispered, "Let it go." Then she walked out, heels clicking softly against the marble floors. Behind her, the door shut. Ahead of her, nothing but light. The scent of sandalwood lingered softly in the hall as Cyril stepped into the new Rise L headquarters. This wasn't a rebrand. This was a reclaiming. The building was smaller than the towering offices she once walked in, heels sharpened by survival. But the warmth in its wood panels, the way the windows caught the early morning light, the laughter echoing from the kitchen where interns brewed coffee, all of it felt earned. Levan stood by the window, reviewing logistics with a local contractor. He wore a navy sweater, sleeves pushed up, hair still damp from the early train ride in. "Good morning," he said without looking, but the softness in his voice shifted when he sensed her there. "Morning," she replied, setting her bag down on the wide, reclaimed oak table that served as their shared work surface. He turned. "I was thinking we turned the upstairs into a quiet resource library." Cyril nodded. "And a private meeting space for counseling." Their hands touched over a shared blueprint, not grabbing, not clinging, touching in a way that signaled presence, not possession. In the corner of the room, a photo hung. A group portrait from the expansion event. No titles, no captions, just women of all ages. Unposed, real. "That's the legacy," Cyril said. Levan looked over. "No, that's the beginning." Across town, in a quiet cafe lined with vintage typewriters and exposed brick, Elena sat with a legal pad in front of her and a half-eaten muffin beside it. She wasn't back to corporate consulting. She hadn't returned to executive assistant roles. She was taking a certification course in mediation. The irony wasn't lost on her. But growth doesn't ask for irony's approval. Her phone buzzed. A message from one of the women in her justice circle. "I didn't go off on my cousin today. I heard her out. I'm trying." Elena replied, "Proud of you. Trying is the first version of healing." She smiled, folded the page she had been writing on, and titled it, "Accountability is not punishment," because that's what she was learning too. Being held accountable didn't mean you were disposable. It meant you were human. And healing from being the accomplice meant facing the mirror longer than you faced the crowd. Daxon's silence wasn't a retreat. It was a reality. He still lived in the same suite, now a long-term lease, because no property under his name held value anymore. The banks had done their part. The board had done theirs. But it was the cultural shift that made the final dent. People didn't flinch when he walked into rooms anymore. They simply walked out, not in fear, in disinterest. He tried speaking at a real estate podcast event once. Only 6 people showed up. 5 were students. 1 was a man looking for a refund. His name didn't matter the way it used to. And maybe that was the true punishment. Not public humiliation, irrelevance. Meanwhile, Cyril sat in a small classroom at a local high school where Rise L had partnered with the district to offer weekend career seminars. The young women were tired. Some were distracted. Some were defensive. But they showed up. That was enough. "I'm not here to promise you life gets easy," Cyril said. "But I am here to say hard doesn't mean impossible." A girl in the back, hoodie pulled low, asked, "You ever get used to being underestimated?" Cyril smiled, nodding slowly. "You stop craving proof from people who don't know how to value you." There was a pause, the kind that settles in when truth lands, and then a hand raised. Another voice asked, "How do you know who to trust?" Cyril answered, "The ones who show up after the applause ends. They stayed an hour past time, because when truth is real, people don't rush, they lean in. That night, Levan came home with paint on his hands. Kitchen or rooftop? Cyril asked, already eyeing the trail of turquoise on his knuckles. Both, he replied, but I didn't mess up your bookshelves. They stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he asked, "You happy?" She thought about the question. "I'm not chasing peace anymore," she said. "I live in it." He walked over, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Then we're good." "Why?" "Because I don't want to be your reason. I want to be part of your rhythm." They didn't kiss dramatically. They didn't fall into bed with cinematic urgency. They just hugged, long enough for everything not said to feel heard. Miles away, Elena stood outside a modest townhome. She was volunteering with a restorative non-profit that offered weekly meals and mentorship for re-entry women. She wasn't on stage. She wasn't quoted. She was slicing sweet potatoes and asking women if they preferred apple cider or cranberry juice. She helped them set up vision boards, not for aesthetics, but for self-direction. And when a woman leaned over and asked, "You used to work with him, right?" Elena didn't deny it. "I did," she said. "And I didn't protect who needed protecting." The woman nodded. "That takes guts to admit," Elena replied. "That's the easy part. Changing is the gutsy part." The woman laughed softly. "Then you got guts, sis." At the Rizal office, the mentorship board grew longer. More names, more connections. Cyril stepped back one morning, reviewing updates. Beside her, a young intern from the Bronx said, "We should call it the Echo Wall." "Why?" "Because when you see your name, you remember you exist beyond survival." Cyril blinked. That was it. The work wasn't about branding. It was about echoing back the power people had been trained to forget. "Echo Wall it is," she said, smiling. Later that day, Levan brought over a drill and mounted the title plaque. No fuss, no press, just names, stories, continuity. In the quiet of their shared home, Cyril read an old email she'd once drafted and never sent. It had been to Daxon. In it, she had tried to explain everything. Her hurt, her loyalty, her patience, her silence, her breaking point. She deleted it, because she didn't owe him a recap of her becoming. She owed herself presence. Beside her, Levan was asleep on the couch, a half-read book on his chest, and his hand loosely holding a pen. She took a photo, not for social media, for memory, for proof that healing wasn't always loud. Sometimes it looked like rest. The annual Equity and Women's Justice Forum was quieter than most high-profile events. No red carpet, no grand orchestra, no luxury brand sponsorships. But it was full of women in sensible heels and worn sneakers, men with notebooks, not microphones, survivors and builders, listeners and learners. Cyril didn't ask to be the opening speaker. The committee had chosen her unanimously. She stood behind the podium. Her dress was simple, a soft grey wrap style with sleeves to her wrist, and a chain of her late grandmother's around her neck. There were no prepared jokes, no shock value slides, only a truth the room was already primed to receive. "I'm not here to talk about betrayal," she began. "We've all seen it, felt it, survived it." Heads nodded. "I'm here to talk about what happens when the dust settles and you realize silence wasn't your weakness. It was your strategy." A soft inhale swept through the room. Silence gave me room to listen, and what I heard was my own power returning. She scanned the crowd. "You don't have to burn everything to rise, but you do have to stop standing where you're no longer seen." In the back row, Elena sat quietly. She had applied to attend like everyone else. No VIP status, no backstage pass. When Cyril stepped off the stage, applause shook the room, not because it was loud, but because it was whole. Elena waited, not to ambush, not to apologize again, just to acknowledge. When Cyril finally came into the hallway, their eyes met. There was no guard, no expectation. "I didn't know you'd come," Cyril said, her voice calm but direct. "I didn't know I'd be allowed," Elena replied. Cyril didn't flinch. Permission isn't mine to give anymore. I know, Alina said, voice steady. I just wanted to say I'm still learning. Still unlearning too. And what's the lesson? Alina exhaled. You can't call it loyalty if it requires silence in the face of harm. Cyril nodded once. Good. They didn't hug. They didn't cry. But something ended in that moment. And something else began. Later that evening, Cyril stood beside Levan on a rooftop terrace in Berlin. The city lights were soft beneath the clouds, and the air held a breeze that smelled faintly of cumin and roasted almonds from the street carts below. She leaned into him, quietly. You did well, he said. I didn't do it to prove anything. I know, he said, wrapping an arm around her. But it proved something anyway. They didn't toast. They didn't pose. They just stayed in the stillness that success, earned without violence, allows. Back in the States, Daxon tried to revive his presence. He attempted a rebrand, posted long reflections online about growth and lessons learned. He filmed a podcast episode from a rented studio, wearing a fitted turtleneck and quoting authors he'd never read. Comments were disabled after 2 hours. Because accountability can't be content, it has to be consequence. Months passed. Rizel expanded into 3 more cities. Their model shifted from just support to structured advocacy. They helped pass a new local ordinance that made non-disclosure agreements in harassment cases unenforceable within their county. The news barely made national press. But in courtrooms across the city, women began to speak more freely. And every time a woman said, I'm not signing that, she carried Cyril's shadow beside her. Not as a savior, as a signal. One Sunday morning, Cyril and Levan walked through the farmer's market hand in hand. A little girl selling handmade cards pointed at Cyril and whispered to her mother. She's the lady from the video. Cyril caught the moment. The mother looked embarrassed and nudged her daughter forward. I'm sorry, she said. She watches your speech on repeat. She says you're the reason she wants to be a lawyer. Cyril crouched down to the girl's level. You want to help people? The girl nodded. And wear nice clothes. Cyril laughed. Both are possible. She bought 5 cards, not because they were perfect, but because someone's voice was beginning and deserved to be heard. A year later, Daxon's last business holding was quietly sold to a women-led equity firm. The acquisition contract included a clause, no founding advisory role will be retained. He wasn't invited to the ribbon cutting. He saw it on the news, from his phone, in an apartment he no longer called home. And when asked later in a rare interview, what do you think was your biggest mistake? He answered, assuming silence was the same as permission. Levan surprised Cyril on their anniversary with a handwritten letter. He didn't list everything he loved about her. He listed everything he respected. The way she paused before reacting. The way she asked questions people were afraid to answer. The way she refused to make her pain public if it helped no one. At the end of the letter he wrote, love made you gentle, power made you clear, but it's your integrity that made me stay. Cyril didn't cry. She smiled. Because not every ending needs tears. Some endings look like beginnings built with better blueprints. Back at Rizel, the interns printed new affirmation cards to hand out at outreach events. One read, I am not what I survived. I am what I rebuilt. Another read, healing doesn't have to be poetic. It has to be real. And another, Cyril's favorite, dignity is louder than revenge. That fall, the assistant who once chose complicity found herself sitting across from a teenage girl in a community center classroom. The girl had been caught falsifying a school report. Her punishment wasn't expulsion. It was a mentorship session. Elena leaned forward and said, the truth doesn't always save you right away, but lying keeps you trapped longer. The girl asked, you ever lied to protect someone? Elena paused. Yes. And it cost me more than the truth ever would have. She reached into her bag and handed the girl a copy of a workbook titled Integrity for the Next Generation. Page 1, she said. Start there. Thank you for staying with us through this journey. Today's story wasn't just about betrayal or power. It was about dignity, consequences, and what it means to rebuild with clarity. Cyril never shouted. She never plotted revenge. But she made every decision count. She showed us that silence isn't weakness when it's strategic, that walking away doesn't mean losing, that real strength lies in what you choose not to become. Levan reminded us that love isn't loud. It's present. It stays. It listens. It supports without asking for credit. And, Elena, she paid the price. But she learned. Growth doesn't excuse betrayal, but it proves that redemption starts with ownership. As you go through your own life, remember, dignity protects your power. Proof speaks louder than suspicion. Loyalty without presence is a performance. And sometimes, the best revenge is peace. If this story moved you, share it. Comment below on the moment that stayed with you. And if you're ready for more stories like this, subscribe to Mr. Charles Stories. We have so much more to tell you. From all of us here, thank you for watching. Wishing you healing, strength, and a powerful year ahead. We'll see you in the next story.